Chimerica, one word. Niall Ferguson coined it almost 20 years ago to describe what the global economy actually was. Not two rival powers in a trade dispute, but one organism running on two opposite kidneys. America borrowed, China saved. The pair held the world's growth on its shoulders for half a century. What you have been told for 10 years is that there is a trade war between two of those powers. That framing is too small. What is actually closing is not a tariff round. It is a marriage, and every marriage that ends has been ending for years before anyone files the paperwork. You have read the headlines. The shape underneath them has a different name and a different timetable. By the end of this video, you will have the timetable. Call it what it is. Chimerica was not an alliance. It was not a friendship. It was a 50-year economic marriage between two people who never agreed on anything except the household budget. And even then, they read it backwards from each other. One earned by spending, the other earned by saving. For half a century, each one's exhaust was the other one's fuel. That arrangement is what is unwinding, not in a quarter, not in a headline, across a decade. And the two sides are not in a fight over who broke a plate. They are in a fight over who keeps the house, who keeps the savings, and who has to start a new life with thinner walls. Drop one word in the comments. Which side of the marriage describes your country better? The one that spends or the one that saves? You will see why that question matters by the middle of the video. If you hold a salary, a mortgage, a pension, or a bank account anywhere on the planet, your purchasing power has been quietly subsidized by this arrangement for as long as you have been working. The dollar's global role, the price of imported goods, the yield on long bonds, every one of those numbers sits on top of Chimerica. When the marriage formally ends, those numbers reset. This is the story of the floor you have been standing on. Start with the architecture itself. Why did this arrangement hold for 50 years if the two sides were opposites? Because they were opposites in a way that fit. That is the whole secret. The United States ran, and still runs, on a paradigm that can be stated in one sentence. Form the resources of today out of the resources of tomorrow. Consume now. Borrow against the future to do it. The instruments that make that possible are the dollar's global reserve roll and the US Treasury market, the deepest, most liquid debt market the planet has ever seen. Foreign savings flow in, get parked in treasuries, and finance American consumption. China ran the mirror paradigm. Form the resources of tomorrow out of the resources of today. Save now. Postpone consumption. Pour the savings into infrastructure, ports, rail, grid, factories, and into export capacity. The world buys the exports. Dollars come back. The dollars get recycled into US treasuries. The cycle closes. Look at that loop once more. American consumption was financed by Chinese savings. Chinese export growth was financed by American consumption. I have watched the framing of this arrangement shift across 2 decades. From globalization works for everyone in the 2000s, to globalization is hollowing out the middle in the 2010s, to globalization was a strategic mistake in the 2020s. The arrangement did not change. The reading of it did. That shift in reading is what is ending the marriage. So hold this reframe for the rest of the video. A trade imbalance between the United States and China is not a defect inside the system. It is the system. Take away the imbalance, you do not fix Chimerica, you dissolve it. Yin and yang fit, until one of them stops wanting to. If the architecture worked, why is it ending now and not 10 years ago or 10 years from now? Because the marriage was built on a bet, and the bet did not pay. In February 1972, Richard Nixon flew to Beijing. Henry Kissinger had prepared the ground. The handshake with Mao that week is the photograph everyone remembers. The strategy behind the handshake is the part almost no one remembers correctly. The opening to China was not a gesture of friendship. It was a long bet wager. Bring China into the global trading system, let a middle class grow inside it, and over time that middle class would push for political opening. A Chinese version of perestroika, the late Soviet reform program of the 1980s that loosened the Communist Party's grip on the economy and, within a few years, on the state itself. The architects in Washington expected a similar arc in Beijing, slower and quieter but pointing the same way. The middle class grew. The political opening did not happen. That is the whole story of the failed bet in one sentence. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, author of The Grand Chessboard, wrote a decade later about the strategy of binding rivals through integration. Pull them in, entangle them in your system, change them from inside. By the record of the last 20 years, that doctrine quietly closed. China was integrated. China was not converted. Washington now reads the same arrangement differently. The cycle that once looked like a long-term political investment now looks like a 50-year transfer of industrial capacity for nothing. Whether or not that reading is fair, it is the reading driving policy. Recognition without conversion changes who owes whom. If both sides now want out, what does the exit actually look like? It looks like a mirror. Whatever the United States has to do, China has to do the opposite. Same surgery, opposite incisions. By the structural reading, neither side gets to skip the procedure. I had to reread the numbers 3 times before the shape clicked. They are simple. Their implications are not. Here they are. The US side. The federal deficit sits around 6% of GDP, a peacetime full employment deficit at near historic highs. By the structural argument, that has to come down to 2 or 3%. 2 ways to get there, and only 2: cut spending or raise revenue. The arithmetic is brutal because roughly 70% of federal spending is social security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans, income support. Cut the deficit by half without touching the social block, and you have nothing left to cut. So the recipe, by this reading, is the recipe no politician wants to read aloud. Trim the social block, raise taxes, slow domestic consumption. Now hold that recipe in your hand for a moment, then ask the political question. How do you sell that package to an electorate that votes every 2 years and feels every grocery bill on the way to the polling station? You do not. That is the answer most political operators give you in private. You delay. You finesse. You hope the next president owns it, which is exactly how a structural problem becomes a structural crisis. If the package were executed, here is the second-order consequence. Less consumption means less dollar liquidity sloshing through the world economy. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency narrows. The dollar slides against the major currencies. That sounds like a loss, but there is a hidden gain inside it. A weaker dollar lightens the real cost of servicing federal debt, slows the growth of the debt itself, and makes American exports competitive again. The first structural ingredient of what people on both sides of the US political aisle now call reindustrialization. A weaker dollar is part of the recipe for bringing factories home. That is not a side effect. That is the mechanism. Now flip the mirror, the China side. Everything is reversed and everything is symmetric. Beijing needs to stimulate domestic demand, turn savers into consumers. That requires a stronger social safety net, real pensions, real health coverage, real unemployment support, so households stop hoarding cash against a rainy day that never officially arrives. Beijing needs to rotate the export-led growth model toward a domestic demand model. That takes years. And Beijing needs to fund that rotation, which means running a wider deficit, by the same structural argument, in the range of 4 to 6% of GDP, using UN-denominated sovereign bonds as a domestic analog to US treasuries. Then push the UN's global status upward through the financial centers Beijing already controls. Hong Kong, the territory Beijing administers as a global financial hub, and Macau, the smaller adjacent territory it also controls. Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore, a man who spent 50 years reading both giants up close from a small island that traded with both, used to say that the small and middle states of Asia would do well to assume neither giant gets to dictate the next century alone, and that the smart move is to be useful to both for as long as possible. That formula travels. It is the operating doctrine of every economy that does not want to pick a side prematurely, and it tells you how the next decade gets watched. Not from Washington, not from Beijing, but from the third and fourth chairs at the table. Singapore, the Gulf states, India, Brazil, the ASEAN bloc. So here is the symmetric picture, compressed. The United States has to start saving. China has to start spending. Washington has to accept a narrower global role for its currency. Beijing has to manufacture a wider one. Both projects take 5 to 10 years. Both are politically painful. Both are structurally unavoidable. Today's America is tomorrow's China. Today's China is yesterday's America. The mirror is the whole story. If the recipe is this clear, why is Washington, under Donald Trump's term, visibly moving the other way on the most important variable? Hold that question carefully, because the temptation here is to score it as a political point. That is not what the analysis is for. The analysis is for asking whether a stated doctrine matches its chosen instruments, nothing more. Trump's own stated doctrine is reindustrialization. Bring production home, rebuild the manufacturing base. By that doctrine, his doctrine, named by him, the structural prerequisite is a narrower federal deficit and eventually a softer dollar, so domestic production becomes competitive again. The instruments chosen point the other way. Direct taxes have been cut, not raised, against a deficit at historic highs. The intended backfill was tariffs, import duties as a substitute revenue line and as a lever against trading partners. Then, in the years following the US Supreme Court ruling on tariffs, the decision that constrained how broadly the executive can use tariff authority as a fiscal tool, the backfill lever weakened sharply. By the doctrine, the same administration stated, the instruments and the goal pull in opposite directions. That is the structural reading. It is not the only reading available, and a serious analyst owes you the others. There is a counter reading. In the counter reading, the tariffs were never primarily a revenue tool. They were a bargaining lever, a way to force trading partners to the table on terms more favorable to US industry, and the deficit problem is bracketed for a second term to handle. By that reading, the current sequence is a tactical bridge, not a strategic miss. The reading has something to support it. Trade negotiations did move on a faster clock than they had under previous administrations. What that reading cannot easily explain is the persistence of the tax cut posture against a record peacetime deficit, after the tariff lever was structurally weakened. A tactical bridge usually has a known endpoint. This one does not yet have one named in public. And there is the third honest possibility, the political reality. Selling tax increases and social spending cuts to the coalition that elected you is the hardest sale in modern American politics. A leader who promised the opposite has to choose between his program and his arithmetic. Most leaders, in most eras, choose the program and let the arithmetic catch them later. From Beijing's vantage, the same period reads as confirmation that the divorce timetable is on schedule and that the other side will not execute its half on time. From Washington's vantage, the same period reads as a setback inside a longer realignment that still gets done. I have watched this kind of off-paradigm bet land before, in an earlier cycle, and I misread it the first time. I read it as recovery. It was the lever being pulled in the wrong direction. The cost of that misread was a year of being wrong about what came next. The structural evidence sits closer to the realignment reading, but both readings have weight, and a viewer who only sees one is being sold half the story. John Mearsheimer, the offensive realist scholar who has spent decades arguing that great powers do not converge, they compete, would say none of this is surprising. By his logic, convergence between two rising and declining powers was always the unlikely outcome. The half-century of Chimerica was the historical anomaly. The divorce is the return to the long pattern. A tactical bluff is a 6-month window. A structural retreat is a 10-year arc. We are watching the second one, dressed in the language of the first. If both sides take 5 to 10 years to make the turn, when does the active phase of the divorce actually begin? By the structural reading after 2028, not before, not as a single event. The Trump term has to close. The successor administration has to inherit the arithmetic. The first hard budget choices have to land. Only then does the visible divergence accelerate. And one real break is worth naming, because honest analysis names its own counter-evidence. The dollar slide is held back by a simple, stubborn fact. There is no real alternative reserve currency on offer. Not the euro, which the European Central Bank cannot weaponize the way the Federal Reserve can. Not the yuan, which is still tightly controlled and not freely convertible at scale. Not gold, which does not run a global payment system. The dollar's slide is therefore a narrowing, not a collapse. It loses share. It does not lose its seat. So when you read forecasts of the end of the dollar, and you will read them in increasing volume, apply this filter. The dollar weakening is not the dollar dying. It is the dollar's global role narrowing while still being the only chair in the room. Pick one and drop it in the comments. Type 1 if you think active divergence starts before 2028. Type 2 if 2028 to 2032. Type 3 if later than that. We are coming back to this video in 3 years to mark the answer. Paradigms do not break in a quarter. They bend across a decade. Remember the marriage I opened with. 50 years on, picture the same object on a different table. 2 rings, 2 signatures. A long settlement document with footnotes that take months to read. No shouting, no broken plates. Just the slow legal end of a household that ran the world's economy for half a century. The question that closes the video is the question that opened it, asked back to you. In the divorce of 2 opposite paradigms, the one built to spend and the one built to save, who do you think actually inherits the next cycle? Drop your bet. 2 words is enough. If this was useful, subscribe. The next conversation is already in production, and it is about which third chair at the table walks away with the most.